Our next presenter will be DeWayne Wilson with the Washington Department of Transportation. He'll be speaking on WashDOT's deck replacement versus rehabilitation experience.
So here's kind of the breakout, the agenda. We're going to talk about our bridge network real quick. I went over it earlier today. Talk about how we do our deck inspections, a little bit of experience on our concrete deck replacements, rehabilitations. Just kind of talk about developing some criteria of replacing versus rehabbing, some current deck conditions, our needs, and then questions. So within WashDOT, we have 6 regions. Each region has a bridge crew that's doing maintenance out there. So they're holding this together. We do our asset management centrally in Olympia. So we get all the information from inspection data, bring it together, centralize it, and then make decisions on priorities and needs, a centralized location headquarters. So again, our bridge network, about 3,300 bridges, but out of those, about 3,000 bridges have concrete decks. And that's what I'm going to mainly focus on today. We can talk a little bit about some of our timber decks and steel decks and those issues, but this presentation is just focused on our concrete decks. To start off with, we have some border bridges. So we have some pretty significant border bridges across the Columbia River, Snake River. We share between Oregon and Idaho. And so again, it depends on who's been assigned kind of as the caretaker of that bridge, gets to make the decision on that bridge, but both states share 50-50 on the maintenance and preservation of those bridges. Bridge network, just kind of this curve or where they're getting older. We have about 266 bridges now that are over 80 years old. If we were to replace them today, about 2.7 billion. And then you can just see every decade or every 20-year period, we have another group of bridges that are going to fall into that category. So again, average age about 49 years old. They're getting older, need some preservation. When we're talking about concrete decks, it's important to look at 2 different types of design types. So I'll call them non-integral concrete bridges. Sometimes people say non-composite. These types of decks would be fairly easy to replace because the superstructure is supporting it. You could take the deck off. If you have a composite or an integral bridge deck, so the deck is integral with the superstructure, it would be difficult, almost impossible, to replace that deck. So almost you have to replace the bridge when the deck gets severely deteriorated in these cases. The other split is we're about 50-50 on bridges that are overlaid versus non-overlaid. So we have a group of bridges that have just bare rebar. From about the early 1980s, we started using epoxy-coated rebar. And then when you get into the overlays, we've done a lot of modified concretes. Have nearly 1,000 bridges with asphalt. And then Andre is going to talk to you a little bit about our polyester experience, the 28 bridges with polyester overlays. So deck inspection, how do we do it? So as the NBI, we have the regular scale of basically 3 to 8 on the NBI scale. But then we've created some, I'll call them agency bridge elements. They're not the national bridge elements, but we have some unique elements for our agency for inspecting the deck. So when the inspectors go out there, they do the NBI inspection, and then they do the BMS inspection. We're looking at the deck element, whether, like if it just had regular reinforcing in it, it might be a deck element 12. With epoxy coating, we make it a 26. And then we have a soffit element, and then if it has an overlay on it, then we have an overlay element. So the inspectors are looking at these, and then we have a couple flags, like a rebar cover flag, that they might note some information on those. So how does it work? So within our state, it's a little different. It's not a transition of condition state 1 to 4 like you'd normally see. We use the different condition states kind of as buckets. So 1 would be the deck is in good condition. Condition state 2 is how much of that deck surface has previous repairs to it. Condition state 3 is how much of that deck surface is spalling. And then 4, we park any delamination results. So this way we can give the inspectors a method that they can use and repeat, and it's easy for them to understand. So you can see in this picture, pretty heavily patched deck. It had over 1,000 square feet of patches in it, which is about 26%. But the soffit element itself was in good condition. So we knew that we could rehabilitate this deck deterioration curve that now, once we get that inspection data back, we can build some deterioration curves off of this data and make some predictions. We like to say once a bridge deck gets to 2% patching spalls, then we will put that in a poor condition. That's the first trigger to get it on the list of needs. And we would like to get it rehabilitated before it gets to 5%. That's kind of the sweet spot for our state, 2 to 5%. As far as deck replacements, in our history on concrete decks, we've replaced 17 decks. That doesn't seem, like astounding, but it is. If you think about a little over 3,000 decks and we've only replaced 17 of them, that means we're doing a pretty good job at preserving them. And so you look at these spots where they are. The Cascade Mountains kind of run down the middle of the picture there between Western Washington, Eastern Washington. We tend to use a lot of salts in the Eastern Washington, so that's why you see a lot more dots there. And then you see a big cluster of dots there kind of in our Tri-Cities area. If this was a cancer map, I'd be concerned because that's where our nuclear power plant is. But since we're talking about bridges, I don't think that's a big deal. But here's the common details. If you take the data itself, you look for common trends. First of all, these are all non-integral decks. Some of them were thin decks, and I'll get into that detail a little bit in a minute. Lightweight concrete, and then Eastern Washington versus Western Washington. And then the age breakout doesn't really mean much because really the amount of salt deterioration has a bigger impact on when we replace these decks than the age. And so if you look at the types of bridges, we did some girders. And on these decks, we got pretty good service life, 60, 70 plus years out of the deck before they needed to be replaced. The one deck that's kind of on the bottom right was a deck over the Columbia River border bridge, had a lightweight deck on it. And we're seeing a different trend when we have bridges with lightweight decks. Again, 6 steel trusses, fairly major. Most of these were due to just concrete deterioration. With the bottom left is the Lewis and Clark Bridge. Again, another bridge with a lightweight deck. And then here's where we get into this interesting trend. These pre-stressed girder bridges, the first generations in the late 50s, early 60s, they were kind of standard plan type bridges. And the engineers decided to use a 5 3/4 inch deck for frugality, for efficiency. And so we're seeing that those decks don't last as long when they get deteriorated. When I look at our inventory, we have about 90 of these bridges with this 5 3/4 inch deck. We replaced 6 so far. We have another 4 in poor condition. And then when we get into lightweight decks, across the Columbia River, engineers were looking to lighten up the load, so they would use lightweight concrete, longer spans on a lot of these bridges. And so at a certain point, they just need to be replaced. We tried to rehabilitate one, and it didn't go so well. And so now, once we get into that deterioration mode, we're going to be tracking it and then planning for a deck replacement. As you can see, the green ones there are the ones that have been replaced. The red ones are on our radar, and then the 2 yellow ones will be in the future. One of those yellow ones is the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, which was built in '49. And so here's a pretty significant bridge at Umatilla. There's a parallel bridges there. The older one is a steel truss built in '55. The approaches were raised, and we replaced the deck on the approaches, and then we also put a concrete overlay over the lightweight deck on the main truss at that time in the 1990, and then it just became deteriorated and it's time for it to be replaced. You can see there that the inspection data was showing over 3,000 square feet of patching on the deck. And this is what they were doing. There was just, all of a sudden the phone would ring, a big chunk of the deck would fall out, and they would have to do an emergency repair on it. So it was due, it was time. So our graphics department had to justify why they have drones, so they put that little video together. This was a project where we're replacing the deck, and it's a lightweight deck, and we have a lot of studded tires, so we like to put a durable concrete overlay on top of the lightweight deck. And so that's what you were seeing is that whole process of putting the modified concrete. It was also a special overlay for us because it's the first time we use fibers within the mix. So next, let's talk about concrete deck rehabilitation. And so rehabilitation generally means for us a concrete overlay, a modified concrete overlay. We will, put asphalt overlays on bridges, whether you call that rehabilitation or just a repair. If we take the asphalt off and we find the deck is too delaminated or deteriorated, we might put the asphalt back on and then program it for rehabilitation in the future. As you can see in this bar graph, what I call first generation is when we put a concrete overlay on a deck that's never had an overlay on it. If we do a second generation is when we're getting into now repairing a lot of those earlier concrete overlays and doing them for the second time. So that's what I call a second generation overlay. This is a big, kind of a busy graph, but it basically shows progression of our concrete overlays, what different types we use. And then we've kind of changed our practice in about 2005. We started using hydromilling as our main method of scarifying the bridge deck prior to a concrete overlay. When you look at the breakout of the condition of these modified concrete overlays, it's about a 50-50 split with a little population in poor condition, but there's a big, 50% almost in fair condition that's going to flop over into poor condition. We're getting anywhere from 25 to 30 years plus out of these overlays. And then if you look at the population where we did a hydromill, it's a subset of that previous one. All of those are in good condition except for one is in fair condition. So the combination of hydromill and the concrete overlay is doing pretty good for us. So far, the oldest one is 26 years. Here's an example of a bridge. It's another bridge over the Columbia River. It's a cantilever steel truss built in 41. We started seeing some deterioration in the deck. Again, asset management part of us, this replacement value would be about $40 million if we were to replace this bridge. It's located up in the northeast corner of our state. The route kind of goes up into Canada, so we get a lot of trucks down from Canada. Not really a good detour. 24-foot roadway with a 6.5-inch deck. And so here's kind of a curve of what we were seeing. Early on, around the early 2000s, we started seeing some deterioration, and then it just kind of took off on it. Once we saw 1%, it went to 2% rapidly, and then 5%. So here's some pictures of a couple panels of we saw about 60 square feet of patching. We said, okay, no big deal, kind of, just take care of it, maintenance. Well, 2007, a few years later, it grew to about 500 square feet. And maintenance said, well, bridge maintenance was located in Spokane, so they said, that's a little too far for us to drive. Hey, roadway maintenance, why don't you take care of that? So they started throwing asphalt in the patches. And that caused a little bit more problems. So in 2010, we did a delamination survey, about 5.4% of the deck, over 1,100 square feet of deterioration. So that started to concern us a little bit. We raised the priority to make it our top priority in the state. And then we were kind of debating, with this much deterioration, should we replace the deck? Should we do an overlay, rehabilitate the deck? We looked at the bottom side, and there was some sides of the soffit that were in poor condition. But what we decided to do is do full depth removal in those isolated areas. We put a containment system underneath the whole bridge to minimize the risk of a hydromilling blow-through, and we decided to rehabilitate the bridge. It was also something where we were this trade-off. We had full closures at nighttime, but only partial closures in the daytime. This traffic control is not desirable with just the little cones up. And so, but we tolerated it. We shielded the hydromill. And then we took all the concrete off down to the top mat of rebar, exposed that top mat. You can see in this picture there's a complete full depth removal there. And then it turned out pretty good. We spent about $1.8 million, got a good project out of this, and it's still in good condition today. If we would have done a deck replacement, it would have been much longer, cost us about $8 million. So as far as the criteria, it's kind of hard. You have to look at these different classes of bridges. So if you look at the thin decks, we could rehabilitate them for the first time, but now what we're seeing is when we try to go rehabilitate them for the second time, it's a little bit more risky. So we've set some criteria there as far as if it's less than 5% patching, first generation, good soffit, we'll go rehabilitate that, put a concrete overlay on it. If it's a normal deck, good soffit, okay, we'll go rehabilitate those. We haven't settled in on a percentage yet as far as when we would go on a normal deck from deck rehab to replacement. An integral deck, we definitely want to rehabilitate that. We can't really replace an integral deck. Now go look at the replacement criteria. Thin deck, second generation. Maybe if it's really deteriorated at a first generation, we might even replace those decks. A normal deck, maybe greater than 5% patching, a bad soffit, that would be a good candidate for a deck replacement. And definitely the lightweight decks. We just think that replacing those, putting in epoxy coated rebar is a good way to go. Current conditions, again, we have a pretty big population of bridges that are in fair condition, and then 107 of them are currently in poor condition. So when you look at that on a map, we put them all on a map, and it may be hard to see the dots on the screen there, but all the bridges that are in poor condition are on this map, but the ones that are in red are poor condition just due to their deck. And so you can see there's a fairly decent number of bridges along our interstate routes, I-90, Interstate 82, and then a lot of those dots are in eastern Washington. As far as our needs, we take all this information, and then we look at some cost. The rehab cost, total project cost, for us is about $80 a square foot. To replace a deck is about $300 a square foot, and then to replace a bridge is anywhere from $800 to $1,000 a square foot. Group those into categories as far as like past due, and the ones that we think need to be done in the next 10 years. And what we're estimating is there's about 600 bridges that we think need to be rehabilitated over the next 10 years. We need about $1 billion to do that. Well, the funding level is about $15 million per year when we need 100. And so we got an $85 million gap there. So some of the bridges that we're concerned about are these reinforced box girder bridges. In our inventory, we have about 421 of those. And then we're estimating 140 of these will need to be rehabilitated over the next 10 years. They become a little bit more difficult, especially now with the traffic volumes. We're having to build detour bridges in between bridges in order to get the traffic off. And that definitely increases the cost up to the cost of basically a deck replacement. This is what we're doing this year, different projects around the state. A lot of those are the concrete boxes. This is what it looks like for 2020. So we held a lottery, and we decided the Eastern region won the lottery. They won the one bridge for 2020. You might as well just take a dart and throw it on the board, you know, if you're just going to fund one project. But we do have a process. We look at the amount of deterioration in the bridge, the type of bridge, and their bridge was in the top 5. Anybody recognize this picture in the Mount St. Helens era? These are the Toutle River bridges, and you kind of see where the flow was on the tree line. That was where the river was when Mount St. Helens blew up. And it kind of closed these bridges for the day back in 1980.
So you did some replacement of lightweight and thin decks. So you have an increase of dead load. Did that influence your load ratings afterwards?
So on a lot of those, we went back in with the lightweight. There's one exception. We had a steel girder bridge where we did some testing on the steel, and we could find out that it could support a normal weight deck. So in that bridge, we replaced the deck with a normal weight deck.
I don't think you can probably answer this, DeWayne, but maybe you can. The local, you're presenting the state bridges, right? Only the state bridges. How do the local bridge develop their needs, and do they have a refined process and a system like this where they compete statewide? I'm just curious. We're only seeing half of the picture.
Yeah, currently the local agencies kind of do it on their own, and there's no coordinated effort between all the local agencies to get a roll up and to see that. It would take a little effort and a little work, but within our inspection program, all the data is normalized between the state and the local agencies. So we could actually pull out those percentages and we could go talk to each agency and say, hey, this is what the data says. What are you thinking with your bridge population? So it could be done with the data we have.
The preceding was produced by the National Center for Pavement Preservation. More information can be found on the web at pavementpreservation.org. Additional support provided by Michigan State University.